Welcome to another episode of the Roundtable. Today, with our team, we're going to be talking about how we're going to be able to break through plateaus. But first off, I think it's important that we define plateaus as something as maintenance in performance that's being held over time, and it's unintentional, right? Like we could always have periods of time where we're aiming to kind of go through this maintenance phase, so we could set up for like an eventual peak or something. But in this case, we'll discuss plateaus as something where you're still trying to break through and hit that next PR, but it's just not happening, right? So in this conversation today, we'll talk about trying to identify why we're in a plateau, some potential strategies that we could use to get out of it once we've identified it, as well as limitations when we do try to implement these things. So I've written down, we'll dial it into two big buckets here. So the first reason why you might not be making progress or why you're stuck in a plateau is not enough stimulus in your program. So Shania, let's open things up with you. What kind of factors do you kind of see when there's not enough stimulus, and how do you identify those things?
I guess not enough stimulus can come down to like time between exposures. So like how frequently someone's doing the lift, and I guess how they're reporting that they're feeling on the day that you either want them showing up or the day that they need to kind of push, I guess. So I think when somebody's kind of got not enough exposure or not enough stimulus, it can almost look like the movement looks detrained, or the bar sort of can feel like really heavy throughout the whole movement. I think are the two big ones for like me as a coach. So I guess when that's like kind of like a constant report, whether it's like, throughout a whole block, or if you're letting it sort of play out for a few weeks, just to see, that's when you obviously need to start looking at, as I said just before, like the frequency of that same lift, or of the same, I guess, like movement pattern. If we're not doing, I guess, squat, for example, like 2-3 times a week, is there a movement pattern that they're doing somewhere within the lead up, or do you need to add one? And then that's kind of just where you can, I guess, look to make changes initially. So I think the first two changes would be one, I guess, will you squat twice a week? Like, is there a variation that you have on one of those days that is capping load too much that you can, I guess, remove first, so that you can add more load to the athlete's back that will help them, I guess, get used to handling more load in the lead up? If you already run sort of just 2 competition squats and there's no variation, do you need to add more frequency? Or can you change the exposure time? So I guess an example would be like, if you're squatting I'll use me for an example, like if you're squatting on a Monday and then a Saturday within the same week, like, is that exposure time between those 2 days too long? So can you change it, or do you need to add more?
Yeah, okay. And I mean, let's follow through with this example, right? Like, say, for example, you've got something like a Monday and Saturday, and the Saturday is usually the one that you're kind of trying to aim to be the strong day, right? But it's just not happening. To explore your point a bit more, it's like there's just so much time between that Monday to Saturday, like 4 or 5 days, that you're probably detraining in the middle of it, right? Or potentially that Monday just might not be enough for you to get some sort of stimulus and come in pretty much at a point where you're recovered and made some sort of adaptations.
Yeah, pretty much. So I guess, like, for myself, for an example, like it definitely, like, one, it works. I think, again, a time like that can be like, we'll touch on this, like, I guess, later down the track, but it could be like a mental thing. Like, if you're like mentally, if you're letting it get in the way of, like, every time you unrack, you're like, oh, that feels really heavy, so you kind of just like not in the right mind frame. Like, do you need to kind of flip that switch? Or I guess, like, for me specifically, it was as simple as adding in a squatting variation on the Thursday. So kind of adding in a little bit more variation in the middle of the week, which just helps to carry that sort of training or that same movement pattern within the squat through to the Saturday, which helps Saturday make I guess, feel that a little bit lighter on the back, and movement feel a little bit more trained.
Yeah. I think another byproduct of adding extra frequency to your training is just increased volume as well, right? If you're adding another day of training, you're overall going to be doing more volume. And I think for some people, when you're coming from this like low volume perspective, what I think people tend to see is fatigue remains relatively, like, quote unquote, well managed. Like people report coming in fresh to their sessions and they should be able to perform, but it's just not able to continue going heavier without it like being forced, right?
Yeah.
Have you guys seen any sort of trends with that where it's like you kind of just run some sort of microcycle and it'll hit a point where it just can't get any heavier before it just starts getting like really, really overshot? Dave, did you want to chime in on this one?
Yeah, sure. So, I guess to answer that question, I've had something similar happen to one of my athletes. Um, and I guess sort of the way we got around it was he reported some of those signs that Shania touched on earlier, like bar feeling heavy, despite feeling fresh. Like he came into the sessions feeling not overly fatigued, like feeling pretty good physically. So those sort of signs are a bit of an indicator that maybe he was coming in a little bit too fresh to the sessions and not having enough stimulus throughout the week. So strategies we used was changing his percentage drop for his back downs on his secondary day. So he squats on a Monday and a Friday. And instead of running like a 10%, we dropped it down to like a 7 or something like that. So just made that day a little bit harder and just kept the weight a little bit heavier so that his overall work, I guess, capacity or his work done on that day was a little bit more. And that was just enough to make sure that when he came to his Friday squat, he was feeling good, feeling strong, and had done enough on the Monday to set him up for a successful Friday session.
Yeah, so that the intensity portion really plays a role there, right?
Yeah.
I guess like we could talk about like what happens if you kind of overdo that kind of strategy, right? So you mentioned like you went from what was it, a 10% drop to a 7.5. I think the obvious limitation is like overcorrecting things and trying to force one sort of variable that's a bit too hard. So like, for example, if we go all the way back to frequency, it's like jumping from say 2 times to 4 times without like this sort of like bridging process, as well as going from volume. It's like if you're naturally doing like 3 sets and 2 of those are back downs and then you go to like an extra fourth set, or you just go straight to straight sets, for example, without percentage back downs. I think that bridging process is a very important consideration where you are when you are coming from a place where it's like not enough stimulus, right? You want to add a little bit and kind of see what happens, because you could always add a bit and then keep adding more. But if you've added a ton to try and overcorrect something, you're going to be at a point where it's like, if I think the worst case scenario, if they do end up hella fatigued, you're just running yourself into the ground as well, and you're going to have to make a second overcorrection.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody else, I guess, looks at this. I know I do just with my own programming and some clients, like my own training, sorry, is that I know that my deadlift can help to carry momentum into my squat at the same time. So I know that if my deadlift is, I guess, is like this day in between my 2 squat sessions at, I guess, X percentage or a certain load, my deadlift will help to carry that into my squat, just because I'm, I guess, like similar-ish position where I'm quite a wide stance squat and then I'm like a wide stance sumo. So I know that for my training specifically, that helps. So it's something that I keep an eye on with like clients as well, if they are kind of similar to me in their squat and deadlift like position.
Yeah, so like if the movement pattern looks similar enough, pretty much like squat and deadlifts are interchangeable when you look at it in the week.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that'll tie in well with, I guess, the second bucket of why you might be plateauing is like, if that doesn't get managed properly, like you said, like once you hit a certain percentage, like things kind of just carry through. If we look at it as like not enough stimulus, are they like separate enough where it doesn't matter?
What do you mean?
So like say for example, if you start too light on your squat or your deadlift, like it doesn't really carry through. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. My point being was like, if you kind of take it to the opposite end of the spectrum where people are doing too much, and we'll kick things off straight off with an example. Like if you didn't know what you were doing previously, and then you kind of just like pushed your squat, pushed your deadlift, the fact that it does carry through and the fact that you are pushing it too heavy is going to have some sort of carryover effect in terms of fatigue, right? So like, let's say, for example, if you had your Monday, Thursday, Saturday, and you had your deadlifts on a Friday, or even that Wednesdays, for example, right? And like, you really pushed that Wednesday, and now no matter what you do, that Friday always feels terrible.
Yeah.
So I guess like
I think that's something we can pick up. Yeah, like as an athlete as well. So like I guess it's the communication between the athlete and the coach, but as an athlete yourself, like being able to pick up on that kind of thing and like realizing that, oh, maybe I am going a little too heavy on this day and it's impacting, the second day following in. And then on the other hand, it's like looking at it, if the bar feels heavy, it could either be like fatigue or it could be the detraining. So it's like looking at, I guess, variables as to which one that is, as the athlete as well. Yeah.
How would you
Like,
kind of delineate between the two, Leanne?
I guess it's both going to feel heavy on the back, but I guess if you're feeling like detrained, it might feel slow. It might feel, I guess, it could be like a positioning thing as well. Like you might feel like it's harder to kind of get into that position. Whereas if you're just generally fatigued, you can still get into position, but it just like, it feels heavy. I don't know. Yeah. But I guess it's looking at like the program itself as well, is something that you can kind of attach to that too.
Yeah. I think to add to that as well, like it's really important if you're trying to assess whether it's fatigue or like detraining, it's important to look at the prior days before the big performing day. And then you can kind of judge like, is this heavier than what I'd usually do? And now does today feel shit? If so, that's probably some sort of carryover fatigue. But if you're just constantly undershooting everything and now it just feels heavy, that's more likely to be some sort of detraining effect, right? And you can kind of see the extreme example, like, for example, like a really aggressive deload and the bar still feels heavy on that week one. That's the kind of feeling or like the kind of trend you'd see where it's like, it's probably more so detraining than it is fatigue, right? Versus like end of a block, pretty much all your numbers have gone up in RPE and now you're still feeling tired. That's more so a sign of fatigue, right? Yeah. So I guess some sort of, I wanted to kind of identify bits and pieces where you are doing a bit too much, right? So like a common symptom that's going to lead you into running into a plateau is probably starting a block too heavy. I think that's a pretty common problem for people that aren't used to using RPE, as well as new to a block or new to a kind of block layout, right? I think as you start repeating the same block layout in terms of like frequency, volume, things like that, you can kind of get a better gauge on like where you should be starting and where you should be finishing, right? I think, I prefer trying to keep the program the same in between blocks, just because for the athlete, it's like, all right, I had this first shot at a block and now I know that I probably started too heavy. Next block, I'm going to repeat and I'll see what happens this time, right? I think us as coaches, when we change too much and we don't give the athlete a chance to kind of explore and feel out their own body in a sense, and what happens when you hit a certain load, you're always, as an athlete, you're always kind of like having to refigure things out. But yeah,
I think like with that like block starting point, that can change for the lifter block to block too, depending on how hard they pushed the block prior. So like, it can be common that if someone went full balls to the wall in a week 5, week 6, whatever it is, being able to acknowledge that, okay, you probably have to take more off in that week 1 to allow yourself to pick back up into your normal week 2, week 3, week 4 loads. And then on the flip side of things, if we're taking this approach where you're kind of carrying a bit more momentum block to block, let's say it's further away from a competition, you just kind of build a bit more of a base, that it might be a scenario where you end the block a little bit more conservatively, so you can start the next block a little bit heavier, or make sure that you're starting heavier than your week 1, the block prior, if I'm making sense. So that's where it's comes down to just creating that momentum block to block and just really facilitating training where you're really getting some like momentum and speed behind you week to week and block to block.
Yeah, that's probably the best method in terms of like trying to break through a plateau, right? Because common problem I see is if you try and start a block too heavy, and I guess it'll apply to like a lagging lift, right? Naturally, if you feel like you have that lagging lift, you're like, all right, I really want to improve on this one, so I'm going to try really hard. And so therefore you're going to try and force it and eventually overshoot it, right? So then by the time you hit that first block, you're probably going to have maxed it out and not being able to elicit any more like progressive overload in a sense. For example,
Mm.
like if you've hit that first block, hit your top single, and it's already at 10, where are you going to go? Right. And
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
gonna affect your back downs. That's gonna affect how fatigued you are as well. So therefore you can't carry it an extra week, even if you wanted to.
I think just from my personal experience, that's where I've always been like with bench press, like in the past. Like, you know, I'd have this idea that, you know, bench isn't my strongest lift, and I've always wanted to try push and push and push. And I have like this idea in my head that I should be doing X amount of weight for X amount of reps. So say, for example, like in a block, I'd get glued to doing a 180 single right from the get-go. So I'd hit a 180, it would be at 8, 8.5, maybe even a 9. I'd pull back and be like, okay, I should be doing 5s at 150. Hit a set of 5, and that's too heavy. And then I just get stuck. And then next week it's the same thing. I'm trying to like, oh, well, I did that last week. I've just got to try and do that again, but better. And then it's not better. And then you go week 3, and it's just like over and over and over again. So from my experience in like this last 10 weeks working with Jason, what's been really powerful with bench, let's take bench for example, is starting that rep work way lighter. Like I started doing 5s or 6s in week 1 at like 125 or like 127, and now I'm doing 5s at like 150 to 155 at like RB 7 and 8, and that's been over a course of like a 10-11 week period. So it's taken a lot of time, but having that prescription where it was literally week 1 was right back to 127, and I was kind of almost forced to do that because it was prescribed, made me take just a lot slower approach.
Yeah, it's incredibly humbling, right? Like I think I took a similar approach to you pretty much across all my lifts, and I've probably felt the healthiest I've ever felt. And there's the obvious byproduct of that, right? Like I think it's yeah, what's the word? I lost my train of thought. I think it's just like intuitive. Like it's obvious that if you don't push it, that you're going to be healthier. But I think
Yeah.
it comes to like an insecurity kind of thing. Like I really want this lift to show, and we all kind of learn that it's through hard work. But then there's also this perspective where you need to dial back for a period of time for things to start pushing forward. What were you going to say,
So
Shana?
like I was just gonna say, like, which again we'll talk about later, but that ties into like the mental side of lifting as well. Like I think like when you do have a lagging lift, like Sam said, and it's like it's the one that you want to move the most, or you want it to like progress the most. So like starting heavier in the moment, you know, potentially seems like the right thing, but all it kind of results in is just like this really frustrated and annoyed feeling after every single session that you do of bench, right? Because like you're starting so heavy, it's not moving how you want it to move. And then it's just like this repeat of like week after week after week in your block that like, as Sam said, like you're going to repeat the load, it doesn't move the way you want it to move, and then you get annoyed and frustrated. So it's not just like physically demanding, it's also just like very mentally draining, because then you're sort of locking yourself into this like space where like you don't feel like you're progressing, so then all you do is get frustrated.
Yeah.
I think a big part of that is like, yeah, like I said before, attaching yourself to like numbers that you think you should be hitting. And like, it's important to acknowledge that you don't have to be hitting those set numbers that you think you should be all year round. Like say, for example, 2 reds and a green on bench, like 140, like it's just this weird like baseline number that I feel like I should be able to rep out any day of the week. But after Worlds, when I've had 2 weeks off, I probably shouldn't be doing that, even though it looks a lot cooler on the bench.
Yeah, sometimes it's like just your ego, any like lifter.
Ego.
It's like ego can get in the way of your progress, and it's like actually just have a bit of patience at the start of the block, and it will end up paying off. But it is hard because you want to be pushing, and like you said, it's a lift. You know, if you have that lagging lift, you want to start heavy, and yeah, your ego is telling you to go heavier, but it's like you kind of need to hold back a little. Yeah.
I think as a coach, we can facilitate that process by capping our athletes, especially the ones that do start the block too heavy. So percentage-based work is really helpful. I think another thing that could also be helpful is, the use of like fatigue singles. Like Stephen Novi's coined this term, but I guess like doing your top set first so you get some sort of productive work in, and then you're going to be in a more fatigued state. So you're kind of holding yourself back in the like top single, top double, top triple, whatever you prescribe, right? So it's kind of doing a double benefit in that sense. And so fatigue can get managed well. And a good progression scheme from that is once you finish the block or you're ready to cap off the block, you could easily just switch the top set over and do the top set first. So you kind of see this like the fruition of your results without the fatigue.
I did that with a lifter really quick just recently. With his secondary squat day, he has a top double and sevens, and we ran one block, and it got to like week 3 and 4, and his sevens were just tanking purely just because the top double was just he was overshooting it essentially. So what I did in the block after the first 3 weeks, I ran the sevens first and then the top double second, and his top double after sevens actually maintained some pretty decent intensity. And then in the week 4, I just flipped it back around and he hit the double and the sevens first. And it just was like a way to, manage that fatigue in the early part of the block so he can still get some good quality rep work in and not gas himself too hard on the double. Yeah.
I think one possible limitation of that is like if you push that volume set first, right? Like, and you end up so fatigued that that top set is like heavily reduced. I imagine you can also feel some sort of like demotivation effect as well, just because that what you're used to hitting when you're in like a less fatigue state versus now that you've added so much fatigue, that could possibly do some damage to someone's confidence, especially if they're already coming from a place of like overshooting, right? So the number's already inflated. I think when you do make a change like that, going from like your regular top set to your fatigue thing is like explaining and educating what's going to happen and that it's okay. Because eventually, right, like if you were to just flip that all right back into say a final block, that number is going to be higher anyways. But it's just educating around like being okay temporarily with that drop in the top end strength for the future.
There's similar ways that you can kind of manage progression as well. So like say for example, going into a competition with one of my athletes, she does like a top set on her pause squat day, but I take it out, I guess, far out from competition. Then once I add that back in, her primary day just like pops off. So it's like something that I can kind of, she knows that, and then once we add that back in, it's like she starts showing up better on her primary. So there's ways that you can kind of manipulate the program in that sense too.
As I think essentially for anyone who is pushing too hard, you need to find a way to kind of add a leash, essentially either in load or finding a way to hold back the top end strength so that you can make positive progression. I think that the main thing is keeping your block in a positive trajectory, right? Because if you feel like it's stagnating, it's pretty demotivating, and it's highly likely that if you are always at top end strength, like things are going to happen. But if you can like progress it slowly over time, that's the best way to, I guess, maintain momentum block to block as well. Cool. I guess jumping off this, right? Like we were talking about it in terms of purely a mental perspective for the athlete. We touched heavily on, I guess, insecurities on people that are constantly overshooting. I want to take it back to people that just aren't pushing hard enough, right? And what Sam said before, like not every day needs, or before our call, not every day needs to be a diamond day, right? Some days are just meant to be shit. But at the same time, if you're, I guess, not having the intent to push in the first place, you can't really get to that end result.
Yeah. So this is something that Jason kind of instilled in me just the other week. So basically saying that, like, you know, yes, some days aren't going to be crack hot, but you can use those days where you aren't feeling the best to try and like rise above and still perform at your best. And I think that was something that was really powerful to me, to kind of just remind myself that, for one, you know, you've got to be pushing in training to try and push past these plateaus, and specifically bench press for me, but also just having the belief that you can too. So like you've got to believe that you can hit that set in reps each week, week in, week out, and progress. Because if you don't, like it's going to feel heavy. It's going to feel like it's slowing down as you progress through the block. So for me, like my experience of it was that I think I had 4s at 155 on bench on a Wednesday, which typically doesn't feel that good on a Wednesday after my big Tuesday. And I was redlining, and my like that week in the feedback, I was like, oh, like felt heavy, felt tired, etc., etc. It was slowing down. Like, what should I do? Should I pull back? And he basically just instilled me that, you're capable of these loads. Next week, just hit it. So the week after, I had an extra rep, so it was 5x5, and just having that kind of, I guess, someone to instill that belief in me was really powerful. But just from a baseline in terms of like going into that session, knowing I'm going to hit an extra rep and I'm going to make it move better than last week, made that session a lot more productive. And so I think it like just comes down to just having that straight belief that through a block you can just keep increasing, keep pushing is really powerful too.
Well, it comes back to like just like boxing ourselves in a way. Like we as athletes, like we're very quick to box ourselves as like, I feel tired, say like everything's gonna feel like shit, or like we like we preempt it. Like it's kind of like potentially like one of the I guess like the worst things that we can do as athletes. And I think that then just also ties into like LJ's post last night, where it's like if you're approaching the bar at any lift with like confidence of like you can do this and like you're going to hit this load or whatever X reps, like you said, Sam, like it's going to move. Like if you're walking up to the bar already doubting yourself, then like you probably shouldn't have that load on there in the first place. So I think that just kind of comes down to just like, again, that communication, like that collaboration side of thing that you have with a coach and an athlete, constantly talking about it. But I think like bouncing back to what Danny said, like, I guess you kind of don't really know what days you need to keep stagnant or what days need to potentially stay around a certain load until you kind of just like push everything, and then you get to a point where like nothing moves. Like you can't come to that conclusion until you push too far. I think like bench is probably one of the easiest ones to use as an example, because we, most people will commonly bench anywhere from maybe like 4, 5, 6 times a week. So it's like until you literally push every single day of bench to your absolute max, and then like that the days that you want to show up on stop showing up, that's where you get the data from, because then that's when you can look back, like you can obviously go back and assess, okay, which days or like what week was like the best that showed up and why, and where do we need to go from this now. But until you do that, you can't really pre-plan or forward plan any of that until it's done, basically.
Yeah, and to add to that as well, you also need to have the humility to like, once you acknowledge that it is the fatigue component, then it's like talking yourself down and realizing, all right, I probably don't need to be pushing this as hard. But like you said, you only find that out once you push everything.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a good way to cap things off. I think what we touched on the most is like in that position of what happens if you're coming from a place where you are pushing it really hard, which I think is the more common scenario. Most people, if you're kind of chilling out, eventually you're going to start being able to push it, right? But if you are coming from a place that's too hard, take a step back, acknowledge where it is, where fatigue might be bleeding into your days, or what might be intentional or what's not intentional, and then go from there. And it's likely if you can start stringing multiple blocks together, that's where you're going to start seeing that more stubborn lift start to show up, rather than trying to force it in every single block. But yeah. Thanks, guys. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Roundtable, and we'll see you in the next episode.